Welcome to the Dayton Mediation Center's online version of the Divorce Mediation 101 Clinic. My name is Arch Grieve, and I'm a mediation specialist who is also a certified transformative mediator through the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation. This workshop is designed for individuals or couples who are thinking about ending their marriage through mediation, whether they're looking at divorce or dissolution, and specifically is geared towards people who live in the state of Ohio. As a disclaimer, we do have to acknowledge that we are not attorneys or magistrates. We do not provide legal or financial advice. The information that's presented in this presentation is from local court websites such as Montgomery County Domestic Relations Court and the Ohio Supreme Court, or other reputable sources. And we do encourage individuals who are thinking about going through a divorce or a dissolution to consult attorneys about their legal rights, specifically for their situations. And just as with any court, citizens are not required to have an attorney and may represent themselves if they choose to do so, but as the Montgomery County Domestic Relations Court Citizen Guide notes, those individuals will have to be held to the same standards and must meet the same legal requirements that attorneys do. And so that's something to keep in mind if that's something that you are interested in doing, and something that you should most likely consult an attorney about if you are considering going through a divorce or a dissolution. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can end a marriage, and we're going to talk about those and look at what the differences are between them. Now, the first is a divorce, and this is where one spouse files a complaint to end the marriage. There are grounds for divorce, and those are outlined by the state of Ohio, and you have to name, what grounds for divorce you are filing under, and then the court would decide the major issues like parenting rights and responsibilities and how the property gets divided up. Now, a dissolution was designed by the state of Ohio to be more of a no-fault divorce type arrangement where both parties together decide that they want to end marriage, and they file a separation agreement that addresses all the issues that the court decides in a typical divorce. And so they file a petition with the court, they appear at a final hearing. You don't have to state grounds against one another as part of the agreement. A legal separation is something that is one step before a divorce or a dissolution, which is where property can be divided and parenting rights can be done, but the couple is not legally divorced. They're still technically together, but they're somewhere in between divorce and marriage. And then an annulment is where one spouse files a claim saying that the marriage was void, and there are certain grounds that you have to meet in order to be able to file an annulment. And so check out the Montgomery County Domestic Relations Court Citizens Guide, page 3, if you're interested in grounds for divorce or an annulment. Now, in order to have a divorce or dissolution, one of the parties at least has to have been a resident of Ohio for at least 6 months at the time of filing, and a resident of the county that they file in for at least 90 days. Now, there are certain requirements under which residency can be waived or venues can be changed in terms of where you file for a divorce or a dissolution, and so you can talk to an attorney to find out more about that if that's something that you are interested in. So domestic violence is a thing that has to do with a lot of different divorces and dissolutions, and it's something that's a special type of case as it relates to the court, and they take certain precautions when dealing with domestic violence in a separation. And so there may need to be a civil protection order issued, particularly if the court determines that there has been an instance of domestic violence. And is important because there are obvious safety concerns. It requires some additional paperwork with the court. One of the parties that's being impacted should definitely seek out help from an organization like Artemis, which seeks to help people who are going through domestic violence. And there's a phone number there where you can reach them. And it also may preclude the ability to mediate if both parties aren't able to come together. And so it's something that's really needs to be taken into consideration if it's a factor. So there are a lot of topics that you can and really have to discuss when you're going through a divorce or dissolution. And this is where mediation comes in a lot of times and becomes really helpful, is when you're looking at things like parenting arrangements and who's going to get the kids when, what holidays they're going to spend with who, what are you going to do for insurance, who's going to get the family home, what about the property that was purchased or inherited during the marriage, who's getting which vehicles, what's going to happen to stocks, bonds, mutual funds, bank accounts, debt, how's that going to be divided up, and then other tax issues, and even how the case is going to be filed. And these are all topics that can be covered in mediation, and where mediation really can be most helpful in working through particularly thorny issues. So when children are involved in a divorce or a dissolution, that is another complicating factor that has to be taken into consideration, obviously. And so there's a parental duty to support children that begins and lasts through the age of majority, which is in Ohio, the age of 18, or when they're finished with high school. It doesn't go beyond age 19 unless there are disabled children, and then the support may have to continue beyond the age of majority. There are some other special cases as well, and you can check out more with how the Supreme Court recommends that judges deal with divorce at the following website. So Ohio does allow for shared parenting, and that is a form of joint custody, and it can be requested by one or both parents by filing a plan with the court. And that plan needs to include all of the following topics as it relates to how the parents are going to care for the children, including where they're going to live, whether any child support obligations exist, what's going to be happening with their medical and dental needs, where they're going to school, what parenting time or visitation will look like, and who's getting to claim child tax credits and when. And so if the court does find that shared parenting is in the child's best interest, then there will be a decree ordered at the time of the divorce or dissolution. And it can also be granted later after the filing with the court initially. And so you can read a little bit more about that at Montgomery County's Domestic Relations Court Citizens Guide on page 9. There are a lot of resources as well for parents who are parenting apart, and one of those is the Ohio Supreme Court's Planning for Parenting Time, and this is available for download on our website at DaytonMediationCenter.org. And what that includes is a lot of different options for setting up visitation times, and so they have a lot of different schedules that are in there that you can look at to see how the positives and negatives of each of those schedules tends to work itself out. And they have, I think, 14 or so different types of arrangements for shared parenting that you can look at. Most of your counties are also going to have what's referred to typically as standard order for parenting time, and this will include all kinds of stuff that need to be covered for any shared parenting agreement. And a lot of times it's helpful to look at those as kind of a starting point for where the parents are going to figure out things like, who gets the kids when, and what holidays are going to look like, and things like that. And so sometimes it's helpful to start with that as a starting point and then make modifications to it. And that's another good potential use of mediation, is figuring out what are those modifications going to look like. You can also develop your own plan and come up with something that's completely different. But it is helpful sometimes to look at one or both of those as a starting point. Another thing that's helpful is there are a lot of web-based apps now, and so there's things like WeParent, Cozy Family Organizer, Our Family Wizard, Co-Parently, and there are a lot of these apps that are really designed to help parents who are parenting apart, and it helps primarily with communication. And so there are calendars and there are communication tools that you can use for talking with one another about your kids, and they can be very helpful, especially if couples have a history of high conflict and trying to deal with speaking to one another in a civil way. And these apps can really help parents get through that and figure out a workable way to parent together even when they're not living together. And so that brings us to the place where the Mediation Center can be really helpful, and that is trying to manage conflict through the separation process and after. And what we found is that there are a number of things that really make conflict difficult, and that includes any time money or property is involved, or there's a history of past conflict. Maybe there are future unknowns that neither party is really sure about, and there are probably different perspectives also makes conflict difficult. So maybe there's a different perspective about what fairness might look like in the divorce in terms of how property is divided, or there's a difference of opinion as to how to raise children. And one of the biggest challenges about divorce is that it brings all these issues to the forefront and really can make figuring that out very difficult. And so what we've done is we've designed an activity that's really geared towards helping you figure out how to respond effectively to conflict. And it starts by understanding how you react when you are confronted with a challenging conflict or conversation. And so what we would like you to do is to take a moment and think through your own difficult conversation. And it doesn't matter how this conversation or conflict turned out, whether it was resolved or whether it's something that you're still involved with. Take a moment though, pause here, and think through how you would answer the following questions. And the first is, think about the very worst moment in that conversation. How were you feeling? What emotions did you experience? And then what did you like and dislike about how you handled the challenging situation, and what do you think that says about you? So go ahead and pause here for a moment, and then once you've figured those answers out, go ahead and restart the video. So hopefully you had a moment to think through how you personally react in those challenging situations. And what we want to do is talk about how we define conflict, which is we define it as a crisis in human interaction. And what we found is that being aware of how conflict actually has an effect on us as individuals is really the first step to figuring out how to respond when we are confronted with a challenging conflict or situation. And so when we talk about a crisis in the human interaction, what we mean is that when we experience conflict, it changes our behaviors, and it has this ability to have power over us. And so what we find is that when people go through conflict, they tend to experience a relative sense of weakness and self-absorption. And that weakness comes with a sense of being unsettled or confused, maybe afraid, or really unable to articulate thoughts. We feel vulnerable. Basically, we feel attacked, and we feel like we just can't figure out how to achieve what it is that our goals are, or how we want to proceed, and we become confused. And this vulnerability leads into this second emotion or category of emotions, which is self-absorption. And what we find is that we become very defensive and we become suspicious of that other person, and it's really difficult for us to step outside of our own understanding of the conflict and the situation and see things from another person's perspective. And so what we say is we become weak and self-absorbed. Now, this is a cycle, and we refer to this as the destructive cycle of conflict, which is that this weakness and this unsettled sense can play into our self-absorption, which also then makes us weaker and more self-absorbed. And as we spiral down, we begin to have an even more negative view of the conflict. Our behavior becomes more destructive. We become more alienated, and we begin to demonize that other person. And it becomes really difficult for us to extricate ourselves from this type of thinking, and we become locked in it. And this can become really destructive when both parties are going through this same cycle of conflict. And we find this cycle plays itself out a lot when we're going through difficult situations, such as ending a marriage. And the effects of conflict on us are, one, it can be a very blinding experience. And so if you see the cartoon to the left, that's kind of what it can feel like sometimes, which is that we are just kind of stumbling through our way through the dark, and we don't really know where we're going, and we feel a little bit helpless because we feel lost, and we just feel blinded by this experience. And then the tongue-in-cheek kind of cartoon on the right has to deal with the fact that it's kind of a paradoxical situation to be in when we are in conflict, because we are self-absorbed, but we don't know that we're self-absorbed. To us, we think that we're thinking rationally and thinking clearly, when many times we are not. And so that becomes a real challenge when our own self-absorption gets in the way of us being able to understand where other people are coming from, or see things from a different perspective other than our own. And part of the challenge in dealing with this is that it is something that's hardwired into us. And so we have a fight or flight or freeze kind of response, or rather a reaction to being in conflict. And so, over here on the right, you can see many of the, physiological symptoms of being in conflict. We start to have dry mouth, fast breathing, our heart begins to pound, and there are things going on in our brain and in our physiology that really impact us. And what happens is, when we get into this mode, we begin to react automatically, and that comes from that place of weakness and self-absorption. And the problem with the reaction is that it kind of precludes our ability to tap into the skills and talents that we might otherwise be able to, use if we were in a situation where we were able to think clearly. And that can get in the way of, achieving our purpose or our intention in, having a discussion with someone else, and it can really modify our intentions. And so what we mean by that is that, maybe instead of trying to do what's best for our kids going forward, maybe we become motivated more by revenge or some other things. And so those reactions can make it really difficult to think clearly. And what we try to do is we try to get to a place where, instead of reacting, we're able to respond. But to do that, we really need to get to this place where we are looking at the opposite of weakness and self-absorption, and really looking at a place of strength and compassion. And so we'll talk about that next. And before we move on, though, I'd like you to take a moment and pause the video again and think about what skills and talents you really lose when you operate from that place of weakness and self-absorption. What are some of those things that could really help you in resolving a conflict? And one of the things that we talk about here at the center is that being in conflict is almost like trying to build a some kind of it's like trying to do a project where you have all these tools, but you just leave them in the tool shed, and you really just try to build something without any kind of tools. What are the tools that you're losing when you're feeling weak and self-absorbed? And then what are some of the negative outcomes that occur when you react from that place of weakness and self-absorption? Just take a moment and think through some of those, write those down, and then once you've taken some time, go ahead and move on. And so what we find is that people can and do make shifts. And those shifts occur along two dimensions. One is the shift from weakness to strength, and the other is the shift from self-absorption to what we sometimes call responsiveness. Other times we might call it compassion or recognition. And the first shift towards strength comes with this increasing clarity. We feel more confident about our own abilities. We have this sense of personal strength and self-confidence. We become more organized in our thoughts, and we're able to think more clearly about what it is that we want and be more decisive. And along with that comes a shift towards responsiveness towards the other. And so we're able to actually give some attention to the other person and be more responsive to them, see where they're coming from and just appreciate their perspective as well as our own. And what we find is that this constructive cycle of conflict can really lead to much better results. And when we come from a place of strength and responsiveness, we are able to then begin to see more positive results in our dealings with them. It can be more constructive dialogue. We're able to connect better, and we're able to humanize them a little bit more. And what we're not saying is that you're going to solve all of your agreements and just decide to stay together. But what we are saying is that becoming more strong and responsive through the decision to end your marriage can really lead to more constructive results in your discussions with the other person. It can help you think more clearly about how you want to end the marriage and how you want to do so from a place of strength and responsiveness to the other person, rather than a place of weakness and self-absorption. And what we find is that when people do this, they're able to make better decisions and they're able to come up with better outcomes than they would have otherwise. So when you put all of this together, this is what our model looks like. On the left, we've got weakness and self-absorption, which leads to this negative, destructive, alienating, and demonizing type of attitude that parties have towards one another. But if they're able to shift and become more empowered and begin to recognize where the other person's coming from, then they're able to get to a place of strength and compassion where the conflict cycle can really reverse itself and parties can become more connected and make better decisions. And so what we do in a mediation and what we would help parties do is make those shifts towards strength and connection. And that's really the benefit of mediation, and really one of the biggest parts of what you can get out of sitting with a mediator is many times, because of our own weakness and self-absorption, it's hard for us to hear, it's hard for us to connect. And what a mediator does is they sit in the room with you and they help you shift and support your own efforts at shifting towards strength and responsiveness. What all this is based on is something called the Relational Worldview. And that worldview kind of holds that we as humans want to act at all times with this compassionate strength. And that compassionate strength may look very different for different people. It can be informed by all kinds of things like our own upbringing or our worldview or our religious beliefs or just our beliefs in general. And those things, though, are values that we hold dear. And the two values of compassion and strength have to do with ourself and other people. And what we find is that we are at our strongest and our happiest when we are able to both connect with people, but also, balance our sense of self. And what we call, a positive outcome is one where individuals are able to balance their own selves with, the needs and concerns of others. And whatever happens and whatever that looks like is what we call, a good outcome. And so acting with compassionate strength or being strong and responsive is kind of our guiding principle or our North Star or compass when we're dealing with conflict. And sometimes it's kind of helpful to think about what it would look like if we didn't have one or the other. And so if you are acting with strength all the time, but you have no compassion or regard for others, then generally we call those people selfish. And it's a trait that we think is really not as valuable. Another flip side of that would be when you act with entire, compassion only and have no self-awareness or no strength. It's kind of mindless and we become like pushovers. And so it's acting with strength and compassion together, which is the goal of this idea of the relational worldview. And what that looks like for you as an individual is not something that you're going to come to, in a day. It's this lifelong opportunity that we have for moral growth as we're figuring out what our compassionate strength looks like for us. And so when we talk about shifts, when we're looking at conflict, there's a question that can be asked, which is, why is it worth shifting to that place of strength and compassion? One of the answers would be that we're better able to articulate our own needs when we operate from compassionate strength. When we come from a place of weakness, it's really difficult for us to get our own beliefs and concerns across to others because we feel attacked. And so when we're able to shift, we're better able to actually articulate our own needs. And then the second point is that we're better able to respond to the needs of others and hear where they're coming from. And that enables us to, in turn, live out what our own personal values are. Just because the marriage is ending doesn't mean that the contact necessarily is going to end, especially when there are children involved. So when we're dealing with people that we're going to have to continue working with, it's something that is worth trying to do in a way that is beneficial to all parties and can help really shift the dynamics of the conflict. Even if it's not going to mean reconciliation totally, it can still mean figuring out a workable way to move forward. And so what we'd like you to do is to take a minute and think, what helps you personally shift from weakness and self-absorption to that place of compassionate strength? How do you make that shift in your mind, and what do you think helps you? And take a moment, think through some of those things, jot those down before moving on to the next slide. So you probably came up with some things that might sound similar to this list, and these are just some possible ways that you might be able to shift. One is creating time and space to think through what it is that you want to see happen. How are you going to figure out what your ultimate ideal would be for how to end this marriage, and what are the ways that you want to achieve that? And so creating some space for yourself can be really helpful. Another thing that can be really helpful is to develop some strategies that help break limited or restricted thinking. And what we found is that we're really not that great at taking other people's perspectives. One of the benefits of mediation is that it provides a place for parties to talk, and a lot of times they get new information because they learn things about how the other party is thinking or feeling that they just weren't aware of. And so developing those strategies can be really helpful. Another thing that can be really helpful is getting input or feedback. And so talking to a trusted person who is able to speak into your life in a way that you will be able to hear them and that that they're coming at it from a place of looking out for your best interest. Sometimes, this is a counselor or a therapist, and sometimes it's a trusted friend or a clergy member of some kind. But really, seeking out input and feedback can help. Another thing is to enhance your personal resources for dealing with the conflict. This may look like going to a conflict coaching session, or it may mean bringing in a third party mediator to help you deal with conflict because it becomes, highly toxic. And finally, what can be really helpful is rehearsing, figuring out what you want to say and how you want to say it in such a way that's not going to provoke a reaction from the other person. And that can be really difficult sometimes. And so, speaking of preparing, one of the things that can be really useful is to figure out what your own reactions tend to be. And reactions, come from that place of weakness and self-absorption. And they can get in the way of achieving your purpose because they can cause you to really change your intentions and how you're dealing with the other party. It might make you more vengeful or more fearful rather than coming from that place of strength. And so identifying and planning for what those reactions are and how you're going to handle them before you actually get into the conversation can be really helpful. Another way to describe a reaction is something that pushes your buttons, and these are the things that get in the way of you achieving your overall purpose. And it's really important to remember that you have a choice in whether you're going to react or respond effectively, and that's really what this training is all about. Another thing that's really important to keep in mind is an awareness of your intentions. And so, being aware of your buttons and how they are pushed, and making sure that that you have a response prepared for when they are pushed is really important. But also being aware of your own intentions in engaging in a conversation can help you stay in that place of strength and responsiveness or connection with the other. And those intentions could be a whole host of things. Maybe you want to figure out how to have a better relationship going forward, even though you're going to be living apart. Maybe you want to figure out how to effectively raise your children together, while living separately. And there are a whole host of intentions that you might have in dealing with ending your marriage in this relational way that can be aided by keeping those front and center when you're having a conversation with someone else. And so we provide a number of tools that are helpful in dealing with conflict. The first is conflict coaching. And this is for you as an individual to sit down in a one-on-one session with a trained coach specialist. And what they will do is help you deal with difficult emotions that come up because of ending the marriage, and you can deal with those in a private way. It can also help you figure out and get clear about what it is that you want to focus on going into the mediation, and really help develop a safety plan for how to deal with emotions that may come up, especially ones that you have a good reason to believe are going to be brought up during this high conflict kind of scenario. And figuring out how to manage your emotions and how to deal effectively with the conflict that is likely to come up can really help you deal more efficiently with the discussions that are involved in a separation agreement and reduce the overall costs, because typically mediation is done on an hourly basis. And so that can be something that's really useful and a good investment of your time and money before going into a mediation. And then the other service that we provide that's useful is mediation itself. And that's where you sit down with a neutral third party who's a trained mediator who can help with the parties' communication. And what they do is they do interventions that are designed to help you hear each other a little bit better, maybe elicit information that you don't have, or say things to people at the table in a different manner than they may have been hearing you before, and just have a conversation in a different way. They can help you work through a lot of the thorny issues that are related to the separation, like how to divide up property, what does child or spousal support look like, what's parenting time going to be, who gets kids when, and that kind of thing. And the nice thing about mediation is that, particularly if you are designing a dissolution separation agreement, it gives you control over the process rather than a judge or another party, and allows you to develop a customized agreement that is going to work for both of you, including a parenting plan. And really dealing with a lot of your issues through mediation by sitting down face to face and having those conversations can be more cost effective than going through attorneys to litigate all of the different ways in which your marriage can end. And so that's some of the ways that it can actually be more cost effective. And that's, again, not to say that you shouldn't consult attorneys. It's just, how do you use your attorneys and how do you use mediation? And sometimes they can be best utilized together. Now, there are a number of different resources that we would recommend parties take a look at. As mentioned, we would definitely recommend getting an attorney, especially if you're coming up with an agreement together. You would definitely want an attorney to at least look it over before filing. Another really helpful and beneficial consultation is with a divorce financial analyst, and you can find ones in your area by visiting the Institute for Divorce Financial Analysts. You can talk to people about child support payment information at the number listed there for the state of Ohio. If domestic violence is a factor, you're going to want to contact a place like Artemis and talk with a case manager there. And then another really beneficial group that we recommend parties check out is just a local divorce support group. And there are usually ones available through meetup.com. If you're in the Dayton area, there is a Dayton divorce support group that is meeting regularly that you can go to. And then for those who are divorcing in Montgomery County, Ohio specifically, there are a lot of pages on the Domestic Relations Court website, including a frequently asked questions page, a citizen's guide, and a whole page of domestic relations court forms that you can find for how to file whatever motion that you're going to be filing. If you are considering going through a divorce or dissolution, we do encourage you to give us a call, and we will talk with you about what your options are and how best to move forward. And so our number is 333-2345, and just ask to speak with somebody about a divorce or dissolution. We hope this has been a helpful workshop, and we look forward to supporting you in any way we can.